Welcome back to the most accurate podcast here at 4for4 Football. As always, I'm your host, John Daigle, ahead of today's Week 5 already preview show. Joined as always for this show, none other than the man himself, who has the Week 5 rankings out for everyone at 4for4.com. It is John Paulsen. Paulsen, friend in life, how are you doing?
Doing pretty well. Excited to be past the one quarter portion of the season, but actually it's not quite because we got 17 weeks of fantasy now. But we're getting close to one quarter.
Nearly one quarter out of the way, Sam, which is more than how many good tight ends there are in fantasy football. Sam Hoppen, of course, director of analytics here at 4for4.com. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. It is, I don't know if I'm glad to be a quarter of the way through. It's just kind of wild that it's already going by this fast, but that happens every single year, so nothing different.
Lots to talk about for everyone on today's show since we experienced the first true injury plethora, a massacre across the leagues. So lots of pivots and fallouts to discuss ahead of Week 5 rankings. But before we begin, I just want to quickly remind everyone that I tried to stop corporate from giving discounts on everything for the rest of the season. But this week, everything, all subs, whether it be DFS, redraft for Paulsen's rankings and projections, my waiver wire column, which is out on the site every Monday afternoon. Everything is being discounted 25% off. So feel free to join us if you have just been thinking about it to this point of the season. Still lots of actionable fantasy football content left to give out. Let's get into some injury fallouts for Thursday night, gentlemen, because Paulsen, for the Broncos running backs, what we saw with Javonte Williams suffering a torn ACL and now being out for the year is OC for the Denver Broncos come out and mention that Melvin Gordon will be the team's featured back moving forward. And that's what we expect, him to lead the team in touches. The issue is that it was still Mike Boone, who in this game at least, when Javonte Williams left injured, ran a route on roughly 45% of the team's dropbacks as their pass catching back, had a drop on fourth down. Cecil Lammey, Broncos reporter, mentioned that the team doesn't trust him in pass pro anyways. And then, of course, they go and poach Latavius Murray from New Orleans practice squad after Murray has a successful rushing day in Alvin Kamara's place for the Saints in London. Short turnaround here on Thursday. So more importantly, how are you ranking these running backs for Thursday night, knowing that someone might be in a pinch trying to replace Javonte Williams off the waiver wire immediately?
Well, for Thursday night, since it's such a quick turnaround and Latavius is probably still looking for his apartment, I don't see a big role for him. If it was a normal week, maybe he could kind of work into the number 2 role, but I think even with that, Boone has the leg up in terms of being around for quite a bit longer. So I'm ranking it Gordon, Boone, and Murray for this week. And then I think long-term it's Gordon, then a pretty good gap, and then Murray, and then a small gap to Boone because we just don't know. Boone has looked good at times, but at the same time, Latavius is more proven player, has been a fantasy asset for a lot of years when he's been healthy and through his days, in his 20s. But I think long-term you're looking at probably a 60-40 or a 60-30-10 split with these three. And I think Gordon is certainly the one to have. If he keeps fumbling though, anything can happen.
5 fumbles in Melvin Gordon's last 5 appearances in the NFL, whereas Latavius Murray has 1 fumble on his last 652 touches going all the way back to 2018. I imagine that's why he got brought in. And Sam, that's why rest of season, if you ask me to bet on one, I still think Latavius Murray has a much greater shot to take over the backfield, even though I do think it's going to be a timeshare, than Mike Boone. How are you treating them rest of season? Melvin Gordon, of course, not a free agent on waiver wires. Everyone will be starting him in week 5.
I would agree with you. I think long-term, Latavius has the best shot to potentially win out and become, have the number 2 role to himself. Again, Mike Boone has been on that team for a little bit longer, but the fact that they brought in Murray so quickly after the injury news to Javonte is, I think, indicative of the fact that they're going to want to get him involved quickly. Now, again, for this week, I think it's a little tough to start him, especially given how poor the Broncos offense has looked at times this year. They've been able to move the ball into the red zone, but once they get into the red zone, it's been a bit of a struggle. And I believe the Broncos rank 30th in rushing EPA per play. So they have not been effective on the ground regardless. So I would lean Latavius Murray over Mike Boone rest of season.
I also want to discuss what happened with the Falcons running backs. Cordero Patterson now out for at least the next 4 games on IR. Damian Williams, currently on IR, could return in a couple weeks once he's eligible to. And then, of course, left over is Tyler Algier and Caleb Huntley, both who are available in a majority of Yahoo and Sleeper leagues. The issue for me, though, Paulsen, that's why I'm curious to get your thoughts, how you would rank them this week, is that this Falcons schedule is absolutely brutal, which is why I haven't been treating the Falcons running backs on the waiver column that seriously, because not only the Bucs this week, but then we move forward and it's nightmarish matchups against, the schedule just exited my screen. Go ahead and talk about this week and I'll pull up the schedule.
They've got Tampa this week, the 49ers next week.
Bingo.
The week after, they've got Cincy, and they're 23rd adjusted fantasy points allowed to running back, so that's not a bad matchup. But you're kind of looking at 2 bad matchups. The Chiefs running backs did pretty well against the Bucs last week, so there is that sort of, story you could tell yourself, to quote our friend Chris Allen. I think, heading into the season, we didn't know for sure what was going to happen with this backfield, and then week 1 began, and it looked like it was going to be Cordero Patterson and Damian Williams to start. If I remember correctly, Algier was a healthy scratch that week 1. He didn't touch the ball, so I think he was actually a scratch. So
yes,
Williams injured his hamstring. He went on IR, so he's not due back this week, but he might be back next week if I understand that correctly. So I don't know if he's still viewed as ahead of the rookie when he does come back, but the rookie's played pretty well. Algier, 5.35 yards per attempt. He's had a couple catches, 1 for 5 yards, 1 for 20 yards. Had a decent game last week with 104 total yards against Cleveland, who are 30th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running back. So this is not like a situation to get super excited about, I don't think, because we just don't know where Damian Williams fits into the scenario, and I think he's worth an ad, but I wouldn't be excited or want to use him in the next 2 weeks.
And that's my concern, Sam. In the last 3 games with Tyler Algier active, he has ran at least 6 routes per game. He has been used behind Cordero Patterson as a backup pass catching option, where now Caleb Huntley has been active in 2 of 4 games. He's totaled 2 routes, strictly a between the tackles bruiser. And I do wonder if people are hyping him for recency bias just because he scored a touchdown this past game, even though Algier was the more explosive player and outperformed him on as many carries. Are you doing anything with this backfield, not only this week, but rest of season?
I do think rest of season and this week obviously counts towards that, and he won't be able to use Damian Williams, but I give the edge to him rest of the season. I think week 1 sort of told us a lot about how they're going to treat that depth chart with scratching Tyler Algier. And the thing I would caution against picking up any of these guys is the Falcons have had a negative pass rate over expectation in every single game this year, which typically is great for running backs, but it could potentially be a 3-headed monster. Plus, you have Marcus Mariota taking carries away from the other running backs. So I do think that, again, if I had to pick up one, it would be Damian Williams. And especially if I don't need a running back right now. Now, there are obviously people who had Cordero Patterson and Javonte Williams, who we just mentioned, that need to add one. And I do lean Algier for this week and going forward. So I guess I'd rank them Williams, Algier, Huntley moving forward, but they're all, I think, well outside the top 30 running backs moving forward.
Marcus Mariota, who is trending to become the first quarterback to average over 8 carries per game and not be usable at all in fantasy. The real showcase here on Thursday night, though, Paulsen, is what to do in place of Jonathan Taylor, since we're not expecting him to play. He was DNP Tuesday. Frank Reich is being ominous about the situation, saying the team is uncertain about his health. I'm going to guess he absolutely does not play. And so what we have left over is Nyheim Hines, which is why I'm curious where you ranked him this week for everyone as a replacement. And Reich mentioned Philip Lindsay in particular. Deion Jackson has been available in every game this year, active over Philip Lindsay, but Jackson also has played 50% of the team's special team snaps. That's why he only has 2 touches. So how many touches do you think Philip Lindsay will receive behind Nyheim Hines? Where do you have both of them ranked?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a situation where Hines leads the backfield in touches. He's going to have a pretty big passing game role, even though, it's been a little spotty here and there this season. The one game that we have to look at in the last 2 years with Jonathan Taylor inactive, I believe Hines had 18 touches in that game. And he didn't find the end zone, but I think he caught 8 passes. But this makes sense, though, to elevate Lindsay, who's probably a bit better between the tackles runner, and have him take some of that rushing load off of Hines, and then let a Hines operate as a passing down back. But he's going to pick up some snaps because Taylor was playing a lot of snaps and was being used on a lot of routes as well. That's not Lindsay's forte. We've seen Lindsay drop passes over the years. That's not his game. So I do expect a pretty big PPR game out of Hines, but I don't have him ranked terribly high. I have him at 30 in half PPR, and that sort of makes him usable, but not somebody you're running out to start unless you're desperate, which I think a lot of owners or a lot of fantasy managers are getting a little desperate with some of these running back injuries that we're seeing. And I think Hines does have some touchdown ability as well in the red zone if Matt Ryan looks his way, as opposed to throwing it to Wally Cox 10 times.
Jonathan Taylor, Sam, also handled 87% of the team's backfield touches this past week. If he's out, is this a situation where you may be trying to swoop in and trade for him to a league mate desperate for running backs? Is there anything you're seeing in Jonathan Taylor's usage outside of just being Jonathan Taylor that makes you want to be high on him rest of season?
I do. I mean, he basically owns the backfield right now. All the reports coming into the season where they were going to continue to use Nyheim Hines, I think, sort of use him to spell Jonathan Taylor. But Hines has 8 total carries on the season compared to, I believe, 81 for Jonathan Taylor. Jonathan Taylor is running more routes as well. The targets haven't totally been there. He had 7 targets in week 1, but then has had 1, 5, and 3 targets in each of the last 3 weeks. So this is certainly as good of a buy low opportunity on Jonathan Taylor as you're going to get. Again, having the short week and higher risk of him not playing given that. And the Colts offense, again, similar to the Broncos, has just not looked great in the first several games of this season. And Taylor is getting extremely high usage. And I think if he's out, it's a pretty clear definition of roles between Lindsay being sort of the between the tackles guy, like Paulsen mentioned, and Hines being the pass catching guy, because something happened this offseason where they just don't trust or don't want to trust Hines carrying the ball.
I would add that the offensive line has been the issue for the Colts. I was looking at the adjusted line yards at Football Outsiders. They're 31st this year in adjusted line yards after a 7th place finish last year. So a big disparity, big drop off in run blocking for whatever reason with that Indianapolis line. So that, to me, doesn't really knock Jonathan Taylor down too much, but he's not running behind a really effective offensive line right now when he does come back.
I want to discuss some matchups here in week 5 because I know a lot of people have questions about what to do with Aaron Rodgers, QB 25 in fantasy points per game and hasn't finished any higher than QB 12 in any game individually this year. Russell Wilson, who is the QB 13 in fantasy points per game this season, but has lacked a ceiling in this offense, this sluggish, slow-paced offense, and then loses one of the most explosive players in this unit. And then, of course, for Matthew Stafford, who 6 interceptions, also not reaching his ceiling. Tyler Higbee, who doesn't get upfield, is a second receiver. Stafford, 5 of his 6 interceptions this year have come from a clean pocket, so it's actually his fault. You can also blame the offensive line. And meanwhile, Jared Goff and Geno Smith are doing nothing but performing and hitting their ceilings because their offenses are elevating them weekly. So, Paulsen, let's talk about what to do with these aging quarterbacks right now, knowing that Goff and Geno are actually out there for people to start this week.
Yeah, it's interesting, the QB2 ranks. I'm still pretty high on Aaron Rodgers. He had the really bad week 1 and then has had 3 straight games of 16 plus fantasy points. He's pretty much a shoo-in to throw 2 touchdowns every week. So he's just barely getting to know his receivers, and Dobbs is showing up and Lazard's back. So I think things are going to trend up for him. And he's got his best matchup of the week, or best matchup of the year this week with the Giants, who are 22nd adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. So I have him ranked inside the top 10. But after that, it's a little dicey. I agree that, Stafford against Dallas, they're 3rd in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. He hasn't looked great. Geno's been great. The interesting thing with Geno and Jared Goff is that they're facing traditionally good defenses in the Saints and the Patriots. But this year, the Saints are 14th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks, and the Patriots are 20th. But I think a little bit that has to do with how bad Rodgers played in week 1. So they're not getting credit for what they did against Rodgers in week 4 with the way those numbers work. So I'm a little leery on Goff still. I think he had a really nice matchup last week. I think if he gets Amon-Ra St. Brown back, that's huge for him. But if he's still throwing to Hawkinson and Josh Reynolds primarily, I think the Patriots will do a better job containing him. And then Smith, in the dome, I think is pretty good with against the Saints. They're 14th, as I mentioned, against quarterbacks, and they're coming off of that London trip, so they might be a little bit jet lagged and tired from that whole trip. He's obviously got 2 really good receivers in Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf, and he's finding Will Dissly pretty much every week for a touchdown, and he runs a little bit, so he's actually performed pretty well. So I could see starting both of them over Stafford, and then you can get into conversations about Derek Carr with a shootout potential against the Chiefs. Russell Wilson, who finally played well fantasy wise against Vegas. He's got a pretty good matchup against the Colts, but I think it's tough. These 9 through 16 are tough ranks this week.
Sam, any thoughts on 9 through 16 this week? Where does Geno Smith and Jared Goff fit for you? Again, knowing that they can be plucked off waiver wires. I also think I didn't mention him, but if Jameis Winston's healthy, even in coming back from London, I think it's a pretty sweet spot against the Seahawks.
For sure. Paulsen took pretty much all of my talking points on Geno Smith, so I won't get into him. I mean, Stafford has been not great. I've seen him get dropped in a number of leagues. They play Dallas, who is 3rd in adjusted fantasy points allowed this week, and has been an exceptional defense thus far. They've had a slightly better schedule, or easier schedule, but again, the adjusted part of that adjust for that schedule, which is nice. So I would lead Smith over Stafford. I think the rest of the rankings, I've got them up here, look good to me. I would probably even put Goff over Stafford, given just how many points that Detroit team is scoring. And to Paulsen's other point is the Patriots defense just doesn't sort of look like its old self. So I'm downgrading Stafford a bit. Outside of Cooper Kupp, they really don't have anything in the way of the passing game. Tyler Higbee's been a nice player, but his fantasy value has been thriving on his targets and not necessarily anything else. So I think if you have Stafford, there are certainly better options available on your waiver wire.
Let's discuss Josh Jacobs, who everyone, of course, is starting if they roster him. But how do we view him rest of season Paulsen for everyone to give them a gauge on trades, whether they are trying to trade high on him or perhaps even buy high on him. Because what we've seen since week 2, last 3 games for the Raiders, is Jacobs handle 71 of 81 running back touches and average an 11% target share in that span. Most recently, this past week, ran a route on a season-high 72% of Derek Carr's dropbacks because they have basically phased out every other running back in this offense. So how do you view Josh Jacobs both this week and rest of season?
Yeah, and that's not what we were really expecting with Josh McDaniels coming in with New England's, the backfield. New England was a constant guessing game, but he's basically decided that Jacobs is I don't know if it's a bell cow. Maybe he's getting towards bell cow status, but definitely lead back status. It doesn't appear that Zamir White is ready to really dig into his workload. Brandon Bolden gets a handful of snaps here and there, and Amir Abdullah is kind of an afterthought right now, even though when he has touched the ball, he's looked pretty good. So I view him as an RB2 rest of season, and you could certainly make a case for him, in the low teens, that 17 to 20 range, alongside Dameon Pierce, Edwards-Helaire, Miles Sanders, Breece Hall, who's trending up, AJ Dillon, I think, and then Damian Harris. I think he's in that group and probably getting towards the top of that group, given his, certainty of workload.
Sam, any thoughts on buying high on Jacobs right now? Perhaps you're a team with a good team with multiple pieces that you can then send for a 2-to-1, 3-to-1 deal, knowing that those good pieces are not starting on your amazing team anyhow.
I do think that's a good option. I certainly wouldn't be selling high on Josh Jacobs. I'd much rather be on the buying end of things. There's a question in the chat that we had about Jacobs versus James Robinson rest of season. And I think Jacobs has an opportunity to maintain his workload through the different game scripts. Like you mentioned, his route run percentage is jumping up, and there's nobody else who's taking away carries from Josh Jacobs at this point. He is second in the league behind the aforementioned Jonathan Taylor in the percent of his team's carries that he's gotten at 78.7%. He is one of just 2 running backs to have every single one of his team's carries inside the opponent's 10-yard line, which is just huge from a potential ceiling standpoint. And so I think, again, I really like Jacobs' rest of season. Again, I think we've talked about it a couple times on this podcast already this year. It's tough to get over the priors that I think I've had and a lot of other people had of him just being a bust from an NFL perspective because he wasn't given his fifth year option and just hasn't looked great. But he's been a solid player this year and is getting the opportunity, and opportunity is king in fantasy football, especially for the running back position.
Someone who is getting opportunity, but it's not mattering at all, is Allen Robinson. As he's run just 7 fewer routes than Cooper Kupp on the season. But again, Tyler Higbee is this team's second receiver, basically. So, Paulsen, are we at a position now, not only where we're ranking Allen Robinson perhaps as a wide receiver 4 or 5, but is he droppable in shallow leagues in your mind?
You're getting there. I have him ranked 49th this week against Dallas, which is kind of a tough matchup. As you mentioned, the fundamentals there are still fairly strong. I mean, I think he saw 6 targets this last week, including some end zone targets, but he's just not jiving very well with Stafford or within this offense, and it might take some time. Again, you're just looking at this compared to whoever's out of there on the waiver wire, and having the number 2 option in the Rams passing game would normally be somebody you'd want to have on your roster, but right now that's Tyler Higbee, and Robinson just hasn't gotten going. He had the one game where he might have caught 2 touchdowns, if not for a penalty or a timeout that kind of erased the second one. We're getting to the point where it certainly depends on the league format and stuff where you might cut him, because it's been kind of a quagmire trying to get any fantasy points out of him, and it's just not looking too positive. I mean, I think generally speaking, though, Sean McVay coach, Matthew Stafford quarterback, Robinson in the number 2 or 3 role, you would want to have that player rostered.
Anything on Robinson's usage, Sam, that makes you want to believe for the rest of the season? Higbee, of course, 24% target share. Matthew Stafford does lead the league in completion rate under pressure, but it's because Higbee has a 3.8 depth of target. So he's literally just dumping it off. And then, of course, it's Higbee. He's not getting upfield at all. So, I don't really weigh that much into Stafford's explosiveness under pressure.
The one thing I will note is, per Next Gen Stats, Allen Robinson has averaged about 2.2 yards of separation on his targets, and that's 14th worst among all players. He just doesn't really look like himself. They've given him a couple of end zone targets, but each of those times he has been just blanketed by the cornerback. And I think at this point, if you have Allen Robinson on your team, you have likely found another better option to plug in at wide receiver or flex. That if you need the running back depth, again, we've talked about all of these injuries. If you need the depth, Allen Robinson, I would not really have any issues cutting at this point. I think it's one of those guys who could be, I'm trying to think of the term for it, but people see him on the waiver wire. It's like, oh my gosh, you dropped Allen Robinson, but what has he done? He hasn't done anything. And yes, the routes run are there, but what is it going to take for you to trust starting him at this point? And because I don't think 1 week of solid usage is enough. It's going to take several weeks. So I certainly would have no qualms with people, again, especially in shallower leagues, dropping Allen Robinson and trying to find a better option.
Someone that we can't drop Paulsen, and we're pretty much stuck with, is the whole tight end landscape, but also Darren Waller, who is still not delivering in fantasy points. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on where to rank Waller this week, or how you're viewing Waller as a player this week. And is there anything you're noticing that should continue to make us higher on him rest of season?
Yeah, it's been kind of a disappointment with Hunter Renfrow out that he hasn't, stepped up more than what he has. He had the good start to the season, 4 for 79 on 6 targets in week 1, 6 for 50 and a touchdown in week 2 on 8 targets. But since then, against Tennessee and Denver, just 5 targets in each game, 3 catches in each game for under 25 yards, both games, even though he's playing 80% of the snaps. I think if you have Waller, you just kind of have to start him and hope, unless you have a better option at tight end. But how many better options are there really out there historically other than Darren Waller? He's starting to look to me like more of a mid-range tight end 1. I mean, I do have him at 4. It's just between him and Ertz and Higbee and Kittle and Goddard. It's just kind of a, take your pick. This is a week where the Raiders may throw the ball more than they'd like against Kansas City. They're 21st adjusted fantasy points allowed to tight ends. So there does have a little bit of shootout potential where he may have to lean, Derek Carr may have to lean on Waller more than he has. But, absolutely with Renfrow out, I would be expecting a lot more in terms of usage than Waller has seen over the last couple of weeks.
Paulsen, I have a question for you. Who would you rather have rest of season? TJ Hawkinson, who just had a massive week, or Darren Waller?
Well, I still have Waller. No, I still have Waller. I had to pull up my rest of season rankings because I want to make sure everything matches. But I had Waller. I still have Waller ahead of Hawkinson. I think Hawkinson's. I mean, I like TJ Hawkinson, but he's been fairly quiet whenever Amon-Ra St. Brown has been healthy. Obviously, he had a giant game last week. Does that lead to 6-7 targets per game in that offense? That'd be great. I think then that if we knew that, I think you can move Hawkinson up to maybe even tight end 3. Tight end, yeah, because it's I've got Andrews and Kelsey well above, and then you've got Goddard, Waller, Pitts, Kittle, Hawkinson, Ertz, Freiermuth. So I think that second tier, really easy to move guys around there and sort of tell yourself a story about how the rest of the season is going to go. My concern with Hawkinson is that his targets are going to dry up once Amon-Ra St. Brown comes back.
I agree, especially if Chark comes back as well. Josh Reynolds available on a majority of waiver wires if both are ruled out yet again. Let's discuss Brandon Ayuk, though, because what we've seen now is Brandon Ayuk has reached Brandon Ayuk 2 games prior to this past game, 30% target share from Jimmy Garoppolo, and then plummeted for 15% target share in week 4. George Kittle, of course, back the last 2 games as well. So, Sam, let's start with you here. What are you doing with Brandon Ayuk, who is basically taking up everyone's bench and not delivering a ceiling we thought he could reach?
I do think he's a potential buy low candidate right now. I think thinking about it, I might rather have Ayuk more than Robinson rest of season. And this is with that, this is just a gut call right here. But over the last 2 weeks, the first 2 weeks with Jimmy Garoppolo under center, the 49ers have actually been right around even in pass rate over expectation. So passing about as much as we would expect, which is different than both the first 2 weeks and what they've historically been. And Ayuk is still running a ton of routes. He actually leads the team in route run percent at 95.8%. Doesn't have a single week under 90% this season, and is being used as that team's deep threat. He has 32.2% of the team's air yards right now for a 10.6 average depth of target. That's giving him a 0.53 Whopper, which is pretty good for a player like him. So I think, George Kittle not being involved is the sort of the big question I would have is, well, does George Kittle get more involved? And if he does he start taking more opportunities from Ayuk? But Ayuk certainly in a position where, again, his usage looks good. He's actually getting the targets and has been able to make something out of those targets.
Let's move on to a few of your charts, Sam, that you brought from everyone who joins us every Wednesday live at 1 p.m. Eastern on YouTube. And let's discuss J.K. Dobbins to start, who, of course, returned, had 2 touchdowns in the mix. Kenyon Drake also healthy scratch for the 2nd consecutive game. How are you viewing J.K. Dobbins in this Ravens backfield right now?
I do think J.K. Dobbins is a sell high candidate for me. This chart here is looking at the average number of high value touches that they give their running backs each week. If you're not familiar, a high value touch is a carry inside the opponent's 10-yard line and any reception that they get. So typically teams with, and this was the part of the concern I had with the Falcons. They're barely giving their running backs high value touches. So that's the concern I have. But this past week, J.K. Dobbins had 8 high value touches, which is the most in a single game for a Ravens running back since Lamar became the starter. And we see with the Falcons, with the Seahawks, they're lower on the end of on this list because they have quarterbacks who have a bit of a rushing ability. And so it's a little bit shocking to see the Ravens sort of in the middle of the pack because they're usually further down this list. So the 2 touchdowns in week 4 was certainly nice from Dobbins, but he still has only gotten 30% and 42% of the team's carries. Now, that's not running back carries, that's total carries because Lamar is taking up so much of that, but he's also only been playing on 50% of the team snaps in the last 2 weeks. He does not really have a role in the passing game. It sort of looks like Justice Hill might have that. He's playing on 56% of the team's third down snaps to just 12% for Dobbins. So I do not trust J.K. Dobbins and what he did in week 4 to extend through the rest of the year.
And my only short-term concern for that, Paulsen, would be we did see Justice Hill leave with a non-contact injury. Looked like a hamstring strain. We haven't heard anything else about it just yet. We'll wait for practice reports. But we still have Gus Edwards returning in what we assume will be a game or two. So what are you doing with both Gus Edwards and Dobbins moving forward?
Well, I think in the short term, Dobbins looks pretty good with Hill banged up. We don't know when Edwards is going to be back. They don't seem interested in playing Mike Davis at all. So I think Dobbins has a pretty sizable workload in the short term. I think when Edwards does come back, if he looks anything like his usual self, then we're probably getting back into that committee where Dobbins is leading a sort of 60-40, 55-45 type split. And then you have Lamar Jackson, vulturing some touchdown carries as well. A couple of the things I noticed from this chart that I thought kind of stood out, the Bills way up there at 4 in high value touches per game. Sam was talking about the rushing ability of some of these quarterbacks, and these teams tend to, not give their running backs these high value touches. And obviously Josh Allen is maybe the best or one of the best rushing quarterbacks in the game. Seeing them at 4 leads me to Devin Singletary, who has really got a stranglehold on that backfield now. James Cook is an afterthought. Zach Moss's playing time has actually been reduced, and all of a sudden you have Singletary in sort of the bell cow role that we saw him in middle to late of last season. And then the Washington Commanders there with Brian Robinson coming back makes me wonder, how quickly he'll get back into that RB1 role that we were expecting him to take when he was shot. We'll see. They're going to ramp him up, I guess, this week and see if he can be activated, but he's back at practice. And then also the Broncos there, Melvin Gordon, if he gets a 70% touch share, they're at 6 there in the high value touches. He jumps out as a player that, obviously Latavius Murray can win that job. It's a whole nother story, but Gordon right now we think is going to be that guy. And if he does get 70% of those touches in that backfield, it's going to be pretty productive.
Singletary, of course, has outtouched Zach Moss 33-8 the past 2 games as the team's bell cow, essentially. For Brian Robinson, though, Sam, how do you view this backfield moving forward? We saw on Sunday that Jonathan Williams got 2 touches to Antonio Gibson's 4 on the team's opening drive, 2 snaps to Gibson's 4 on the team's opening drive. And now Gibson's snaps have actually decreased in every game this year, leading to a season-low 41% snap rate in Week 4. Now, the past 2 games also, we need context because they played the Eagles and Cowboys, and Carson Wentz was an absolute mess. So they were a negative game script. It makes sense that Antonio Gibson doesn't have that role because he's never had that role under Ron Rivera. But as Paulsen mentioned, Robinson coming back. So what are you doing with this backfield?
I do think that the game script is certainly a big part of it. Antonio Gibson is averaging about 5 high-value touches per game. J.D. McKissic, 4.8. So both about the same workload, but they're very different types of high-value touches. J.D. McKissic's mostly coming in the passing game for sure. But all offseason, we heard about them wanting to sort of plunge Brian Robinson into this starting role and essentially relegate Antonio Gibson to backup duty. So I think J.D. McKissic's role is fine and is stable where it's at. And he'll benefit a little bit more if the Commanders continue to have a negative game script. But I do think that Gibson and Robinson start to split some of the rushing work specifically. I mean, it's a miracle that he's coming back this soon. I think it's an incredible story. And I do think that if there is an opportunity, I don't know if you're selling high necessarily on Gibson, but if you want to try to trade Gibson to one of these running back needy teams that we've talked about, then there might be an opportunity because, again, based on everything we've heard, it sounds like Robinson is going to be heavily involved.
Is that how you view them rest of season as well? Even if Robinson isn't active in Week 5, Paulsen, Robinson, then Gibson, then McKissic?
Yeah, I mean, this was headed towards a Robinson-led backfield with McKissic probably as the third down back and Gibson as just the straight RB2 prior to the gunshots that Brian Robinson took. So I don't know how quickly he'll be back into that, headed towards that role, but I think that was the desire. And, a couple of weeks ago, I think you quoted a news item that they just didn't have a timetable for Robinson. I think when you hear that, you think, oh, this is long term, but they're just not telling us the timetable apparently because he was back or he's back this week in terms of getting involved in practice and starting to ramp up. But it might be 2 or 3 weeks before they feel like he's ready to sort of take the role that he was in. I think conditioning has got to be a huge thing for him. He couldn't have been doing much running during this recovery. So I would expect a committee. He might get a few touches this week and then start to ramp up if he's even active this week. So I think Gibson has another week or two where he could have some good production, but he's going to turn into a pumpkin here pretty soon.
And I still question if Robinson will have this role in negative game script as the pass catching back over McKissick, since McKissick is great at that. And we expect this team and how bad they are with Carson Wentz to perpetually be in negative game scripts, perhaps taking Robinson off the field. So I don't want to tout him too much as like an RB2 rest of season, like a lot of people seem to be doing. You have notes on Devonta Smith for us, Sam, a chart as well, as A.J. Brown has not seen any lower than a 25% target share in any game this year as Eagles wide receiver 1. Devonta Smith suffered a little bit of an ankle tweak this past game, came off the field for a little bit, but still 16% target share, had those explosive week 2 and week 3 performances. How do you see the Eagles passing game and Devonta Smith in particular right now?
Yeah, so the chart we've got up now shows each team's individual passing rate over expectation by week. And there are a couple teams we're going to talk about here whose week 4 pass rate over expectation sort of very differently from their pass rate over expectation through the first 3 weeks. And the Eagles are one of them. They dropped significantly in week 4 against the Jaguars. And there was some weather implications with this. It was raining. The Eagles got down 2 scores pretty quickly, but by the middle of the third quarter, they were in control of that game. Now, even though they threw the ball only 25 times, they ran it 50 times in this game. A.J. Brown still had a solid day. He caught 5 catches for 95 yards. But again, Devonta Smith only had 3 catches for 17 yards, like you said, left the game a little bit early, but came back. I think you should be buying Devonta Smith and starting him with confidence going forward. The Eagles, I think, through the first 3 weeks showed us that they're not going to run the ball as much as they had last year. Now, we still have yet to see what a competitive game against the Eagles looks like because they've been in control for most of their games. But Devonta Smith is still running a route on nearly every snap, has not run a route on fewer than 92.7% of the team's dropbacks in a single game this year. He's clearly the team's wide receiver 2. So I think he's certainly a great buy low if you can, if someone was scared by his performance this past week.
Sharp Football's Rich Rebar also noted that Jalen Hurts hasn't thrown or rushed for a touchdown in the second half of any game yet this year because the Eagles' schedule's too easy. They just haven't been pushed at all in the second half. So we actually haven't seen A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith, and Jalen Hurts reach their ceilings just yet. Anything else stand out to you in this chart, Paulsen?
I think it's interesting to see the Buccaneers. I know they played the Chiefs and the Packers last 2 weeks, trailing in most of those games. But as that receiving core gets healthy, they start to get back to their pass happy ways. They're not running the ball particularly well either. I think Leonard Fournette and Rachaad White had 6 carries combined in a recent game. And so I think Chris Godwin is getting back to kind of being a must start after, I think getting through this last week unscathed, playing a lot of snaps, seeing a lot of targets. Hopefully he's fully healthy now. And he had an extra couple of weeks there for his knee to heal as well. So, I've got him ranked at 21 this week, thinking that he's going to get back to his usual ways.
A season high route run on 86% of Tom Brady's dropbacks this past week. Sam, how do you view the Bucs wide receivers moving forward?
I do think, like Paulsen said, if Godwin is playing, you're going to want to start him. This was, I think, the first week that the Bucs had all of their big pass catchers playing, and again, it was against the Chiefs. They were trailing for the majority of it, but pass rate over expectation takes some of that game script aspect out of it. And again, I don't remember seeing them rush the ball once in the second half of that game. So I do think that this is more indicative of what they're going to be rest of season. They play the Falcons this upcoming week, so that could be a game in which they're in a positive game script. But I do think you should bump up the Bucs receivers a little bit from where they had been the first couple of weeks. The health is obviously a concern. I believe I saw before the show that Cole Beasley did retire just out of the blue. So he is, he wasn't a huge factor, but that's another player that they're not going to have. So Scotty Miller, again, I think is someone else to watch out for potentially, but I think a slight bump and upgrade for these Bucs wide receivers going forward.
Yeah, if I could add, the upcoming schedule is really juicy. Atlanta 28th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks or to receivers. Pittsburgh 24th, Carolina 18th, Baltimore 25th, and the Rams 30th. They don't play a team inside the top 10 in wide receiver adjusted fantasy points allowed until week 15 when they play the Bengals, who are third. Now those numbers can change, but really a juicy upcoming schedule for Tom Brady and those Tampa receivers.
And I will be curious this week how this offense operates since, as we mentioned, pass rate over expectation tries to take these game script situations out of it. But again, the Bucs trailed 14-3 against the Packers and 21-3 against the Chiefs. So they didn't really have any choice but to throw. We'll see what happens between Fournette and all of these receivers. You also have notes on the Jets receivers, Sam, because we saw Zach Wilson come back and Corey Davis then lead the team in targets with a 19.4% target share. Davis also has now played 6 full games with Zach Wilson. Garrett Wilson obviously wasn't available for this team last year, but Corey Davis has averaged 7 targets and a 20% target share from Wilson in those 6 games. My Garrett Wilson came in with 6 targets, 16.5% target share, and then Elijah Moore, who continues running the most routes on this team, just 4 targets and an 11% target share from Zach Wilson. What are you doing with these receivers who I think will just have ebbs and flows and will never actually start and sit the correct one each week?
You're probably right. You mentioned a lot of this stuff. Corey Davis ran a route on 73% of dropbacks. Both Wilson and Moore were at or above 90% in the game this past week. But you see again here on the chart that they did not throw the ball as much as you would expect. And, they were in a negative game script for part of it. I mean, it was pretty much within a 1-score game, most of it. And it's just interesting to see that with Zach Wilson coming back and playing a Steelers defense that hasn't been nearly as good as they had in the past. So I think I think we talked about Elijah Moore a little bit last week and him being a potential buy. I think that window is still open since he didn't have a massive game. I've seen a couple people pick Corey Davis up off of waiver wire. I would not trust him to start for sure. I think his weeks are going to fluctuate a lot more than Wilson and Moore, and will sort of be the third guy between them once it all gets figured out. So I would probably rank Moore higher than Wilson rest of season still, but it is very close between those two.
Reference, Elijah Moore this week ranked as Paulsen's wide receiver 41, Garrett Wilson 37, and Corey Davis 43. Just all jumbled up together with no real way to predict who's actually going to lead this team in receiving. On the other side of the ball this week, though, Paulsen, quickly, I know you want to talk about Teddy Bridgewater, who is a viable streaming option. I was in the 4-4 Discord, and I already put in that I like the Dolphins laying the field goal this week. I think the Dolphins may have the best quarterback in this matchup.
Yeah, Teddy has been pretty good when he's had an opportunity to play, and he's got his best weapons probably of his career with Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. Chase Edmonds is a good pass catching running back. So and a pretty good scheme going there. So I think he is, you could pretty much pick him up off the waiver wire and get a decent start out of him this week.
Any thoughts, Sam, before we get out of here on, I know this is from left field, but Gabriel Davis, who has now seen his target share decrease in every game, leading to a season low 8% target share this past week. Of course, his last 2 appearances have also been post-injury from week 2.
It's interesting because he has a very similar profile to Allen Robinson in his usage right now, but I really want to believe in Gabe Davis a lot more. I think just with the way that offense is and who the quarterback that's throwing the ball to Gabe Davis is, I tend to lean towards buying more on Gabe Davis than I would Allen Robinson for sure. And again, the fact that the Bills currently lead the league in pass rate over expectation, I think the ankle injury, I don't know how much that is impacting Davis, but you can't start Davis by any means this week, but if I see one good week of usage from him, I'll be ready to start him again.
Let's give them both scenarios, Paulsen, between Isaiah McKenzie and Khalil Shakir. Shakir, of course, only playable if McKenzie is ruled out with that concussion. McKenzie, an amazing option, I think, against the Steelers if he's active for this game. Where are you ranking both if McKenzie starts and if McKenzie sits?
Yeah, just back to Gabe Davis. I think the ankle is, I saw some footage of him running routes. He's not able to cut off of it like he has been, and he's not a fantastic separator, route runner as it stands. So he has to get as much separation as he can so that he can make his contested catches. So what you're looking for, I think, with Gabe Davis is that he starts to get in some full practices. Maybe we see some footage that looks better and that ankle heals. I think he's a really nice fantasy asset rest of season if that ankle doesn't bother him all year. On the flip side, your question, John, I have McKenzie in all my actively managed leagues. He was definitely a player I was targeting late. I was touting him. And now that Jamison Crowder is out of the way for probably 8 weeks or more, that slot role is going to be his if he's healthy. I think it's a wheels up situation if he's able to play. They might limit him a little bit this week if he is a go because of that really hard hit that he took. He told on a podcast, he said that it was the hardest hit he's ever taken in football. So I am a little questionable whether or not he's going to play. So I don't have him in the rankings right now. I have Shakir at 48. So he's sort of in that, wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5, dart throw type option. But when you look at this team as a whole right now, and this passing game as a whole, they are facing the Pittsburgh Steelers, who are 26th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to receivers. Stefan Diggs is obviously going to carry the load. Gabe Davis is gimpy. So if it is Shakir in that third role, he might actually be the number 2 option. Dawson Knox might be the number 2 option, and they're going to outproduce where I have them ranked. I currently have Davis at 28, and I'm just hoping that we get a full practice and some, more health on that ankle as we get through this week. So that's how I look at it. If McKenzie does play, I'll have him ranked higher than where Shakir is right now, but there is a little bit of a worry that they'll rotate him with Shakir just as he gets through this 1 week after that really hard hit that he took.
The rest of your start sit questions can be answered by going to 4for4.com and checking out Paulsen's week 5 rankings. Paulsen, what else do you have on the site for everyone this week?
Well, I got to finish up Sneaky Starts today, doing the podcast, of course, on Friday, and working with Jeff Hicks, who's going to be writing the breakout receiver model weekly for us.
Sam, what else on the site?
Hopping to conclusions out this morning. We'll have the season-long expected fantasy points model article out tomorrow morning, and as always, charts on charts.
Anthony and Paulsen, as he mentioned, will be back on Friday. TG Hernandez and myself on the DFS MVP show live 6:30 p.m. Eastern on Friday. Until then, good luck this week and be a little bit kinder than what's required. We'll see you next time.